The champagne glass shattered against marble as Carolyn watched her husband David escort his mistress through the lobby of the Grand Oceanic Resort, the very property she'd secretly purchased 48 hours ago for $340 million. Her hand instinctively moved to her 6-month pregnant belly, but David's eyes remained locked on Rebecca, the receptionist turned mistress who'd upgraded from checking in guests to checking out with other women's husbands. The designer luggage Caroline had packed for their anniversary getaway suddenly felt heavier, though not as heavy as the humiliation burning through her chest when David's voice cut through the atrium. "Security! Remove this woman from my vacation." His vacation. In her hotel. Caroline's tears began to fall, but they crystallized into something harder when his mother, Patricia, emerged from the elevator, her laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers as she pointed at Caroline, dragging her suitcase toward the exit. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the trembling, sobbing woman they were mocking had just become the most dangerous person in their lives, and the mercy he would beg for was about to become the most expensive commodity he'd never afford. But could a woman who'd hidden a $1 trillion empire from her own husband find the strength to weaponize her power when her heart was shattering into pieces? And what kind of justice awaited a man who threw away the one person who'd given him everything, including a second chance at the life he'd nearly destroyed? Dear viewers, this story will take you on a powerful journey about hidden identity, betrayal, and the ultimate reckoning when someone underestimates the quiet strength of a woman scorned. You'll discover how self-worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to rise when they try to break you. This tale teaches crucial lessons about the dangers of greed, the consequences of deception, and the importance of seeing people's true value beyond material wealth. After watching, please drop in the comments what lessons you've learned and what you would have done differently if you were in Caroline's position. Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? Subscribe now for more gripping, entertaining, and life-changing stories that will make you think differently about loyalty, respect, and redemption. 7 years earlier, Caroline had stood in a hospital chapel wearing borrowed scrubs instead of a wedding dress, but her smile had been genuine as she'd whispered vows to David Mitchell, a man who'd just survived a near-fatal car accident that had erased his consulting career and left him with $340,000 in medical debt. The nurses had called her foolish for marrying a man who'd lost everything, but Caroline had seen something in David's eyes that reminded her of the father she'd lost. A good man crushed by circumstances beyond his control, deserving of a second chance that her hidden billions could quietly provide. Now standing in the lobby of the Grand Oceanic Resort with her Hermes luggage at her feet and her marriage disintegrating before her eyes, Caroline realized she'd confused gratitude with love, but David had confused her generosity with weakness. The resort manager, James Whitmore, stood frozen behind the concierge desk, his face drained of color as he recognized the woman being publicly humiliated. 48 hours ago, he'd sat across from Caroline in a lawyer's office as she'd signed the acquisition papers under her maiden name. Caroline Westbrook, sole heiress to the Westbrook industrial fortune, a woman whose great-grandfather had built half of America's railroads and whose trust fund generated more interest in a day than most people earned in a lifetime. But she'd asked him to keep her identity confidential, and now he understood why. She'd wanted to surprise her husband with an anniversary gift that consisted of owning the very place where they'd honeymooned 7 years ago on a budget that hadn't allowed for anything beyond the cheapest room. "David, please." Caroline's voice cracked as she reached for his arm, but he jerked away as if her touch contaminated him. "We're supposed to be celebrating our anniversary. I planned everything." "You planned everything wrong as usual," David interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt that made several guests gasp at its cruelty. "Rebecca and I need this vacation. You need to learn your place, which is definitely not here ruining my romantic getaway." Rebecca giggled, her hand sliding possessively around David's waist as she pressed herself against him with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won a prize. But her eyes held a calculating coldness that Caroline recognized too late. The receptionist had been studying Caroline for months during her secret visits to the property, noting every kind gesture, every generous tip, in every moment of vulnerability that Caroline had displayed while inspecting what would become her latest acquisition. Rebecca had identified the softest target, a wealthy woman's inattentive husband, and had executed her strategy with the precision of a corporate raider, though she had no idea the woman she'd betrayed owned the very building where she'd plotted her conquest. "Security!" David's voice echoed through the atrium, and two uniformed guards appeared, their faces uncomfortable as they approached Caroline. "Escort this woman off the property. She's trespassing and harassing paying guests." James Whitmore started forward, his mouth opening to intervene, but Caroline caught his eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. The pieces weren't in position yet, but they would be soon. And when they fell, the impact would be seismic rather than merely volcanic. Caroline reached for her luggage, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, but no one moved to help her. The baby inside her kicked hard, as if protesting the injustice, and Caroline's hand instinctively moved to cradle the life she'd created with a man who now looked at her like she was garbage to be removed. 7 years of building him up from nothing, of quietly paying off his debts while he believed his consulting business was thriving, of attending his mother's cruel dinner parties where Patricia Mitchell had made passive-aggressive comments about Caroline's simple background and lucky catch of a husband. All of it culminated in this moment of absolute betrayal. But then Patricia herself emerged from the elevator, fresh from the resort's exclusive spa, her face glowing with expensive treatments that Caroline's secret monthly checks to David had funded. The older woman's eyes landed on Caroline, and instead of the maternal concern any decent person would show to a pregnant daughter-in-law being publicly humiliated, Patricia's face split into a smile of pure malicious delight. "Oh, David, darling, you're finally doing what I've advised for years." Patricia's laughter rang out like breaking glass. "Look at her, dragging her luggage like the charity case she's always been. I told you that you married beneath you, didn't I? But at least you found someone more appropriate now." Patricia's finger pointed at Caroline's tears like they were entertainment, and something inside Caroline that had bent under years of quiet tolerance finally snapped. Not loudly, but with the silent finality of a bridge cable giving way before the entire structure collapses. The trembling woman they saw was real, but the calculation behind her tears was something none of them could fathom. Caroline's hands shook as she pulled her phone from her purse, but not from weakness, from the adrenaline of a decision that would change everything. The security guards hovered awkwardly behind her, clearly uncomfortable with escorting a pregnant woman, but David's impatient gesture urged them forward. Rebecca whispered something in his ear that made him smirk, and Patricia's laughter continued to echo off the marble floors like a soundtrack to Caroline's humiliation. "I just need a moment," Caroline said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she pulled up her contacts. "Please, just one moment to call a car." "Make it quick," David snapped, already turning back to Rebecca. "We have dinner reservations at 8, and I don't want this drama ruining our evening." Their evening. Caroline's fingers found the contact labeled simply Thompson, her head of security, a former Secret Service agent who'd protected 3 presidents before Caroline had hired him to protect something far more valuable, her anonymity. She typed quickly, "Protocol 7, authorization Westbrook Cardinal 9, full implementation by morning." The reply came within seconds. "Confirmed. All assets in position." Caroline looked up at James Whitmore, whose face had gone from pale to ashen as he watched the scene unfold. She gave him the slightest nod, a gesture so subtle that no one else noticed, but James understood immediately. He disappeared into his office, and Caroline knew he was making calls that would set machinery in motion. Machinery that David and Patricia couldn't imagine existed. A machinery that Rebecca's small-time ambitions couldn't comprehend. The flashback hit Caroline as she gripped her suitcase handle. Her father's voice in her childhood bedroom, his hand weak from the cancer that would take him 6 months later. "Caroline, sweetheart, wealth isn't about what you own. It's about who you are when no one knows what you own. Promise me you'll live a real life first before the money defines you. Promise me you'll know what love looks like without dollar signs attached." She'd promised, and she'd kept that promise by hiding her identity when she'd met David in that hospital where she'd been volunteering, using her mother's maiden name, Caroline Brooks, and presenting herself as a simple pharmaceutical sales representative. She'd wanted to know if someone could love her for who she was, not what she was worth. While David had seemed perfect, humble after his accident, grateful for small kindnesses, talking about rebuilding his life with integrity and hard work. But Caroline had confused his gratitude for her financial support with gratitude for her presence, and she'd missed the crucial moment when his appreciation had curdled into entitlement. The consulting business she'd helped him start through anonymous investor funding had succeeded, but David believed his own mythology that he'd pulled himself up through talent alone. He'd started staying late at the office, started mentioning how exhausting it was to come home to Caroline's neediness, started comparing her unfavorably to the ambitious young professionals at his firm. Rebecca had been the inevitable conclusion to a story Caroline should have seen coming, but love had made her blind in ways that business acumen never could. "Time's up," the security guard said gently, clearly hating his job at this moment. "Ma'am, we need to escort you out now." Caroline nodded, picking up her suitcase, but her eyes swept the lobby one final time, cataloging every detail, every witness, every camera angle that would document this moment. The crystal chandeliers she'd personally selected during the renovation, the marble imported from the same Italian quarry that supplied the Vatican, the original artwork she'd commissioned from emerging artists who needed exposure. Every inch of this place bore her fingerprints, but David saw only a backdrop for his betrayal. As she walked toward the entrance, her phone buzzed with incoming messages. "Thompson. Legal team activated. Forensic accountants beginning audit of all joint assets. Thompson. Private investigator reports compiled. 3 years of documented infidelity with 6 different women, including current subject. Thompson. Medical team on standby at secure location. Vehicle arriving in 90 seconds. Thompson. Media blackout holding. When you're ready to release the story, we control the narrative." Caroline paused at the doorway, turning back to see David kiss Rebecca deeply, his hand on her lower back in a gesture that had once been reserved for his wife. Patricia applauded the display like it was performance art, her eyes finding Caroline's with a look of such triumphant cruelty that it deserved its own documentation. "Take a picture if you want, dear," Patricia called out mockingly. "Something to remember the day you finally learned you weren't good enough for my son." Caroline's phone was already out, but not for the reason Patricia thought. She snapped 3 photos, not of David and Rebecca, but of Patricia's face twisted in malicious glee, of the exact moment when someone revealed who they truly were, when they believed they held all the power. "Thank you," Caroline said quietly, her voice steady now despite the tears still tracking down her face. "I'll treasure these forever." The automatic doors opened, and Caroline stepped into the warm evening air. But she wasn't stepping into defeat. She was stepping into war. And she'd just documented her enemy's positions perfectly. The black Mercedes that pulled up wasn't a taxi, but a vehicle from Caroline's private fleet, driven by Michael Chen, her personal driver for the past decade. He stepped out immediately, his face carefully neutral as he loaded her luggage. But his eyes held a question that Caroline answered with a single word. "Everything." Michael nodded once, understanding that everything meant every protocol, every contingency plan, every asset that Caroline had kept hidden during 7 years of playing the role of supportive wife to a man who'd never suspected that his simple spouse controlled a financial empire that dwarfed the GDP of small nations. The car pulled away from the Grand Oceanic Resort, but Caroline didn't look back at the building. She'd see it again soon enough, though under very different circumstances. Instead, she opened her tablet and began reviewing the documents that Thompson had already prepared. Legal instruments so comprehensive that they'd been drafted by 3 different law firms to ensure no conflict of interest could challenge their validity. The first document made her breath catch. A forensic financial analysis showing that every penny David believed he'd earned through his consulting business had actually come from Caroline's anonymous venture capital fund. His successful pitches to investors had been predetermined approvals. His networking breakthroughs had been carefully orchestrated introductions. His entire professional identity was a stage play she'd financed, directed, and produced, though he'd believed himself the sole author of his success. But the second document made her hands clench with fury she'd suppressed for months. A private investigator's report detailing David's affair with Rebecca, stretching back 14 months, including hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and a particularly damning jewelry purchase. A diamond bracelet Caroline had noticed on Rebecca's wrist 2 weeks ago, the same bracelet she'd admired in a boutique window, before David had told her they couldn't afford luxuries right now because of a business downturn. There had been no downturn. There had only been David diverting money Caroline's fund had transferred to his business account, money intended for their future and their child. Money he'd spent on impressing a woman who'd targeted him specifically because she'd researched his wife's frequent visits to the resort and assumed any woman inspecting a property that thoroughly must have wealthy connections worth exploiting. Rebecca had been half right, but she'd catastrophically underestimated the scale of what she was attempting to steal. Mrs. Westbrook, Michael's voice came through the intercom, using her real name for the first time in 7 years within David's earshot, though David was miles away now, celebrating his freedom. We're approaching the medical facility. Dr. Harrison is ready for your examination. Caroline had almost forgotten. The baby. Her hand moved to her stomach, feeling the flutter of movement that reminded her this wasn't just about David's betrayal anymore. This was about protecting a child from a father who'd thrown them both away like inconvenient baggage. About ensuring her daughter, she'd learned the gender last week but hadn't told David yet, would grow up understanding that dignity wasn't something others could grant or revoke. The private medical facility looked like an upscale office building, which was precisely the point. Dr. Harrison, Caroline's personal physician for 15 years, met her at a private entrance, her face warm with concern that felt like a balm after Patricia's cruelty. "Let's make sure you and baby are handling the stress," Dr. Harrison said gently, guiding Caroline to an examination room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a medical space. "Thompson briefed me on the situation. I'm so sorry, Caroline." The examination took 30 minutes, but Dr. Harrison's conclusion brought the first genuine smile to Caroline's face since the champagne glass had shattered. "You and your daughter are perfectly healthy. Strong heartbeat, excellent positioning, no complications from today's stress. She's a fighter just like her mother." A fighter. Caroline liked that. Her daughter would need to be a fighter in a world that would judge her for her wealth, that would question whether she'd earned her advantages, that would expect her to apologize for resources she hadn't asked to inherit. But Caroline would teach her something David had never learned, that privilege was responsibility, not permission, and that power wielded without character was just tyranny wearing expensive clothes. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lead attorney, Margaret Winters, a woman who'd represented Caroline through a dozen corporate acquisitions and who approached legal warfare with the enthusiasm of a general planning a siege. "Margaret, divorce papers drafted. Prenuptial agreement review complete. He signed away all claims to your assets, though he never knew what assets he was signing away from. Post-nuptial agreement he signed last year. Remember the life insurance paperwork? Further reinforces the separation. Joint account freeze ready on your authorization. His business accounts, which are technically your business accounts through the fund, can be frozen simultaneously. Credit cards in his name tied to your banking infrastructure can be canceled within the hour. The corporate apartment lease where he's been taking Rebecca, it's owned by a subsidiary of your holdings. Eviction notice ready. His car lease? Through your automotive group. Repossession team on standby. Margaret. Say the word and David Mitchell wakes up tomorrow, owning exactly what he brought to this marriage 7 years ago. Nothing but medical debt and an overinflated ego. Caroline stared at the message, her finger hovering over the reply button. This was the moment where mercy and justice stood at a crossroads, where she could choose to be the bigger person everyone always expected women to be, or she could choose to be the person David's actions had earned. But then she remembered Patricia's laughter, remembered David's look of disgust at his pregnant wife, remembered Rebecca's triumphant smile as she'd claimed another woman's husband in another woman's hotel. Caroline typed 3 words. Execute everything. Now. Then she added a 4th message. But I'm not done yet. 72 hours after Caroline had been escorted from her own resort, David Mitchell's world began collapsing with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. But he didn't understand the architecture of his destruction until it was far too late to evacuate. The first explosion came at 6:47 a.m. when his credit cards declined at the resort's breakfast restaurant, where he'd been ordering champagne and caviar for Rebecca. The second came at 7:15 a.m. when his business account showed zero balances and a notification that the investment fund supporting his consulting firm had withdrawn all capital due to breach of ethical conduct clauses. The third came at 8:30 a.m. when hotel security, different guards than the ones who'd escorted Caroline out, arrived at his luxury suite with an eviction notice stating that the corporate account holder had terminated the reservation effective immediately. But the fourth explosion was the one that made David's legs buckle. A message from his lawyer stating that divorce papers had been filed and that Caroline Brooks Mitchell was actually Caroline Elizabeth Westbrook, sole heir to a fortune that made David's successful consulting business look like a lemonade stand in comparison to a multinational corporation. "Hon, this is insane," David stammered to Rebecca, who was frantically packing her designer bags. Bags that Caroline's private investigators had documented being purchased with David's diverted funds. "Caroline doesn't have money. She worked in pharmaceutical sales. She drove a 7-year-old Honda. She clipped coupons, for God's sake." What David didn't know was that Caroline had driven that Honda and clipped those coupons while watching him, testing whether he'd love a woman who appeared ordinary, whether he'd stay faithful to a wife who wasn't flashy or exciting, whether his character would hold when the spotlight wasn't shining. He'd failed every test she'd never told him he was taking, but the results were now being graded with merciless accuracy. Rebecca's face had transformed from confident mistress to calculating survivor in mere seconds. "You told me she was nobody. You said she was lucky to have you. You said..." Her voice climbed toward hysteria as she realized she'd bet her receptionist position at a 5-star resort on a man who turned out to be a kept husband, divorcing his keeper. The phone rang. David's mother. Patricia's voice came through shrill with panic. "David, what is happening? I just received a letter from my country club stating my membership has been terminated due to non-payment, but I paid through the year, and my credit cards aren't working, and the bank said something about the trust fund account being closed and..." "What trust fund account?" David interrupted, his mind racing through implications he couldn't quite grasp yet. "Or the monthly deposits I've received for 7 years. The ones you told me came from your business success as a way to thank me for raising you properly. The ones I've been using for my lifestyle." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Caroline had been funding his mother's country club, her spa treatments, her luxury car lease, her apartment in the expensive part of town, all while Patricia had mocked Caroline as a charity case, all while his mother had laughed at his wife's tears 3 days ago. David's hands shook as he opened his email and found a message from an unknown sender with the subject line, "The Full Accounting." Inside was a spreadsheet that detailed 7 years of financial support, $2.3 million in business funding, $890,000 in debt payments from his pre-marriage accident, plus $340,000 to his mother's lifestyle accounts, $125,000 in gifts he'd given to various women including Rebecca, and a final line item that made his vision blur. "Cost of believing you married down instead of up. Everything you thought you'd built." But the final paragraph of the email was what dropped him to his knees. "You threw a pregnant woman out of a hotel she owned because you were embarrassed by her tears. Your mother laughed at those tears while spending money that woman had quietly provided for 7 years. Your mistress smiled while wearing jewelry bought with funds that woman had anonymously invested in the business you thought you'd built through talent alone. You didn't just betray a wife. You betrayed the architect of every success you believe was yours. The mercy you'll beg for isn't mine to give anymore. Because I spent 7 years offering you mercy you never knew you needed. I offered you love without conditions, support without recognition, and grace without limits. You responded by treating me like garbage when you thought I had no power. Now you'll learn what powerlessness actually feels like. P.S. The Grand Oceanic Resort has a new policy. Rebecca's employment has been terminated for conducting personal affairs on company property. You're both banned from the premises. Your mother is welcome to visit only as a paying guest at full rates. I hope your romantic vacation was worth it. C.W. David's phone rang again. His lawyer, his accountant, his business partners, all calling with versions of the same question. Who is Caroline Westbrook? And why does she control everything you thought you owned? The answer was simple. She was the woman he'd thrown away, and she'd been the only thing keeping him from falling all along. 48 hours later, David stood outside a modest apartment building, the only place he could afford now that his corporate housing had been revoked, holding a bouquet of flowers that cost more than he should have spent. But desperation made people foolish with their last dollars. His mother sat in his beat-up rental car, her face drawn and aged without the expensive treatments she could no longer afford, her country club friends suddenly unavailable now that scandal had attached itself to the Mitchell name. Caroline's lawyer had agreed to a meeting, though Caroline herself wouldn't be present. Margaret Winters sat across from David in a coffee shop, her expression professionally neutral as she laid out the terms. Mrs. Westbrook is willing to offer you a settlement, $50,000 annually in child support payments directed to a trust for your daughter, which you'll have supervised visitation rights to see twice monthly. Your business debts have been cleared as a final gift, but all future income will be yours to generate without her support. Your mother's debts have also been cleared, but any future financial decisions are hers to manage. The apartment you're living in is owned by a Westbrook subsidiary, and you may remain there at fair market rent, no special treatment. In exchange, you'll sign away all claims to Mrs. Westbrook's assets, all rights to public discussion of the marriage or its ending, and you'll agree to a comprehensive NDA regarding her identity and fortune. I don't want her money, David said, his voice hollow. I want to apologize. I want to explain that I was an idiot, that I threw away the only real thing in my life, Mrs. Westbrook doesn't want your apology, Margaret interrupted, her voice kind but firm. She wants you to be a good father to your daughter. She wants you to learn that people's value isn't determined by what you can see on the surface. And she wants you to understand that mercy isn't weakness. It's a choice made by people strong enough to grant it. She's choosing to give you mercy now, not because you've earned it, but because her daughter deserves a father who isn't destroyed, just educated. David's tears came then, not the manipulative tears of a man trying to win sympathy, but the genuine tears of someone finally understanding what he'd lost. Will she ever forgive me? Margaret gathered her papers, preparing to leave, but she paused at the question. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, Mr. Mitchell. It's about accepting that some chapters close and new ones begin. Mrs. Westbrook has forgiven you enough to let you move forward. Whether you forgive yourself is your journey now. 6 months later, Caroline stood in a private hospital room, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Emma Catherine Westbrook had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's smile. Caroline's mother, who died when Caroline was young, but who taught her that grace and strength weren't opposites but partners in building a meaningful life. David had visited twice under supervised arrangements, his face showing genuine emotion as he'd held his daughter, his words careful and humble in ways they'd never been during their marriage. He was working now as an actual consultant, building a modest practice without anonymous financial backing, learning what real success felt like when earned rather than gifted. Patricia had sent a letter, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that she judged wrongly and lived wrongly, and that she hoped one day to know her granddaughter if Caroline was ever willing to grant that grace. Rebecca had moved to another city, her social media presence scrubbed of all references to luxury vacations and five-star resorts. Her last message to David, a simple statement. I'm sorry for my part in breaking your family. I hope you become who you should have been all along. But as Caroline looked at her daughter, she realized the story wasn't about David's transformation or Patricia's regret or Rebecca's remorse. It was about the moment when someone threw you away and you had to decide whether to let that define you or refine you. She'd chosen refinement, and in doing so, she taught everyone around her that true power wasn't about crushing people who hurt you. It was about giving them exactly enough rope to either hang themselves or climb to better heights, and then watching what they chose to do with it. Emma stirred in her arms, tiny fingers grasping at air, and Carolyn whispered the promise she'd been preparing since the moment that champagne glass had shattered 72 hours before her empire struck back. You'll grow up knowing your worth isn't determined by who sees it. You'll understand that kindness isn't weakness and that grace is the ultimate power move. And if anyone ever tries to throw you away because they don't recognize your value, You'll know you were raised by a woman who turned her worst day into her greatest lesson. The door opened and Dr. Harrison entered with discharge papers, but her smile held something more. There's someone here to see you. Says she's your sister? Caroline's heart jumped. She hadn't seen Melissa in 3 years. Not since her younger sister had moved to Europe for medical school. Not since before the marriage that had consumed so much of Caroline's attention. But Melissa rushed in now, her eyes wet with tears as she gathered Caroline and Emma into a careful embrace. I got on a plane the moment Thompson called me, Melissa said, her voice fierce with protective love. I'm so sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. But I'm here now, and I need you to know something. You were never the one who wasn't enough. You were always the one who was too much for small people to handle. And anyone who couldn't see that wasn't looking at you. They were looking at themselves and seeing their own limitations. Caroline's tears came then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen truly, completely, without filters or facades or the careful performance of being less than she was to make others comfortable. I'm going to be okay, Caroline said, and for the first time in 7 years, she believed it completely. We're going to be okay. Emma yawned, her tiny face scrunching in an expression of pure infant indignation at being awake, and both sisters laughed. The kind of laughter that heals, that rebuilds, that reminds you that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that city, David was learning to live with consequences. Somewhere, Patricia was learning that cruelty had costs. Somewhere, Rebecca was learning that shortcuts led to dead ends. But in this room, Caroline was learning the most important lesson of all, that the people who tried to break you gave you a gift they never intended. They showed you exactly how strong you'd always been and how much stronger you could choose to become.